Courtroom 4. B smelled of polished oak, stale coffee, and impending ruin. Richard smoothed his custom Brioni suit, entirely confident he was about to leave his wife of 15 years with absolute pennies. He never noticed her smile. It was the calm, terrifying curve of a woman who had already won. Richard Sterling sat at the heavy mahogany plaintiff's table, exuding the kind of bulletproof arrogance reserved exclusively for self-made millionaires who believed their own press clippings. At 48, he was the CEO and founder of Sterling Global Logistics, a freight and supply chain empire currently valued just north of $85 million. He checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch, irritated that the proceedings were eating into his afternoon tea time at the country club. Across the aisle sat Catherine. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy Dior suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe but elegant chignon. She didn't look like a woman whose life was about to be financially dismantled. She looked perfectly, almost unnervingly, at peace. "Don't let her posture fool you," whispered Arthur Pendleton, Richard's high-priced bulldog of a divorce attorney. Pendleton adjusted his silk tie, his eyes fixed on Catherine's legal counsel. "Rossi is playing a weak hand. They're going to ask for 30%. We offer 8, settle at 12, and we execute the post-nup." Richard smirked, leaning back in his leather chair. 12% is generous for a woman who hasn't worked a day since 2010. Let's just get this over with. 5 years ago, after Richard had been caught in a spectacularly messy, public affair with a 26-year-old marketing executive named Chloe, he had managed to manipulate the fallout entirely to his advantage. He convinced Catherine to stay, to protect the children and the family image. But under the guise of rebuilding trust, he forced her to sign an ironclad post-nuptial agreement. The document, drafted by Pendleton's aggressive legal team, stipulated that, in the event of a divorce, any assets held in an individual's name or within an individual trust would remain the sole and exclusive property of that individual, immune to equitable distribution laws. Richard had spent the last 5 years quietly transferring his wealth out of joint accounts. He moved massive chunks of equity, real estate, and liquid capital into complex corporate structures, shell companies, and trusts that he believed were completely shielded from his wife. He had meticulously engineered her financial ruin. He was the master of the board, and she was just a pawn who hosted charity galas. Judge Harold Carmichael, a stern man with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, banged his gavel to signal the start of the hearing. "Let's proceed. Mr. Pendleton, I have your filings regarding the dissolution of the marital estate based on the 2021 post-nuptial agreement." Pendleton stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. The facts of this case are exceptionally straightforward. My client, Mr. Sterling, is the sole driving force behind the family's wealth. Per the post-nuptial agreement, signed willingly and with independent counsel by Mrs. Sterling 5 years ago, we are simply asking the court to enforce the document. Mr. Sterling retains ownership of Sterling Global Logistics, the primary residence in Buckhead, the vacation estate on Red Mountain in Aspen, and his individual investment portfolios held at First Horizon Bank and through offshore holdings. We are prepared to offer a lump sum alimony buyout of $4 million to ensure Mrs. Sterling's continued comfort. $4 million. Out of nearly $100 million. Richard crossed his arms, stifling a grin. He looked over at Catherine, expecting to see the mask slip. He expected tears, a trembling lip, or a desperate glance at her lawyer. Instead, Catherine caught his eye, and she smiled. It wasn't a sad smile. It wasn't a brave, covering up the pain kind of smile either. It was a slow, knowing smirk that radiated an icy, absolute confidence. A cold spike of adrenaline hit Richard's stomach, though his rational brain immediately dismissed it. She's delusional, he thought. She doesn't understand the math. Next to her, Sylvia Rossi, a notoriously sharp attorney from the prestigious firm of Rossi, Vance and Sterling, no relation, slowly stood up. She didn't carry a massive stack of banker's boxes. She carried a single, slim leather portfolio. "Your Honor," Sylvia began, her voice smooth and conversational, entirely devoid of the aggression Pendleton had used. "We do not contest the validity of the post-nuptial agreement. In fact, we rely on it." Richard frowned. Pendleton stopped shuffling his papers and looked up, his brow furrowing. "We agree entirely with Mr. Pendleton's core argument," Sylvia continued, walking gracefully toward the center of the courtroom. "The post-nup states that any asset held in an individual's name or managed by a sole beneficiary trust belongs exclusively to that individual. Where we differ, Your Honor, is simply on the matter of whose name is actually on the paperwork." Judge Carmichael peered over his reading glasses. "Clarify, Ms. Rossi. The financial disclosures provided by the plaintiff list these assets under his corporate entities." "They do, Your Honor," Sylvia said, pulling a crisp, watermarked document from her portfolio. "Because Mr. Sterling hasn't actually looked at the foundational operating agreements of his own shell companies in over 3 years. He pays accountants to hide his money, but he fundamentally misunderstands who controls the hiding places." Sylvia approached the clerk and handed over the first document. "Let us begin with the vacation estate on Red Mountain in Aspen, valued at $14 million. Mr. Pendleton claims this is his client's property. However, in 2022, to avoid a massive capital gains tax and shield the property from a pending corporate liability lawsuit, Mr. Sterling transferred the deed to a Delaware-based holding LLC called Silver Leaf Holdings." "Standard asset protection," Pendleton interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "My client is the primary shareholder of Silver Leaf." "No, Mr. Pendleton, he isn't," Sylvia countered softly. "I direct your attention to Exhibit A, the operating agreement for Silver Leaf Holdings. When the LLC was formed, Mr. Sterling directed his then CFO to establish the company. What he failed to remember was that the initial seed capital for that LLC, a sum of $50,000 required to open the corporate accounts, came directly from my client's private inheritance fund, a fund left to her by her late grandfather." Richard felt the air thin out in the room. He leaned over to Pendleton. "What is she talking about? I own Silver Leaf." "According to Delaware corporate law," Sylvia continued, projecting her voice to fill the quiet room, "and the specific articles of incorporation drafted at the time, Catherine Sterling is the sole managing member and 100% equity owner of Silver Leaf Holdings. Richard's name appears nowhere on the ownership schedule. He is merely listed as a non-equity guarantor. Therefore, per the post-nuptial agreement, Richard forced Catherine to sign. The Aspen house belongs entirely to her." Pendleton quickly snatched the copy of Exhibit A from the defense table, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His face drained of color. "This is an administrative error. The intent was clearly for my client." "The post-nup doesn't care about intent, Counselor," Judge Carmichael interrupted, tapping the document. "It cares about the ink, and the ink says Catherine Sterling owns the LLC." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He stared at Catherine. The smile hadn't left her face. She picked up a silver pen and began casually doodling on her legal pad. "Let's move on to the liquid assets," Sylvia said, not missing a beat. "Mr. Pendleton mentioned the offshore accounts, specifically a Cayman Islands holding shell named Apex Ventures. Mr. Sterling uses this shell to funnel international logistics profits, thereby lowering his domestic tax burden. He believes there is roughly $22 million in liquid capital sitting in Apex. Richard swallowed hard. He had set up Apex specifically to hide cash from Catherine during the 5 years he was planning his exit strategy. Nobody knew about Apex except his most trusted wealth manager in Geneva. 2 years ago, Sylvia explained, pacing slowly, Mr. Sterling needed a massive, quiet loan to cover a disastrous personal investment in a Miami commercial real estate venture that went belly up. He didn't want the loss showing up on Sterling Global's books. So, he borrowed $8 million from an anonymous private equity firm called Horizon Capital Group. To secure the loan, he put up his voting shares in Apex Ventures as collateral. A sickening, horrifying realization began to bloom in the back of Richard's mind. He remembered the loan. He remembered the faceless equity firm that had bailed him out with incredibly favorable interest rates. He defaulted on that loan 6 months ago, Sylvia stated calmly. He missed 3 consecutive balloon payments. Per the loan agreement, upon default, the collateral, the controlling shares of Apex Ventures, was legally forfeited to the lender. "Objection!" Pendleton shouted, jumping to his feet, genuinely panicked now. "This is a divorce hearing, not a corporate bankruptcy tribunal. The inner workings of Horizon Capital have absolutely no bearing on this marital estate." "It has every bearing, Your Honor," Sylvia fired back, her eyes flashing, "because I am holding the incorporation documents for Horizon Capital Group. And wouldn't you know it? Horizon Capital is a private trust entirely funded, owned and operated by Catherine Sterling." The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second, her hands hovering over the stenotype machine. "You," Richard choked out, ignoring all courtroom protocol as he pointed a shaking finger at his wife. "You were the lender. You bought my debt?" "I didn't buy it, Richard," Catherine finally spoke, her voice like velvet wrapped around a steel blade. "You literally handed it to me. You were so desperate to hide your failures from the board, you didn't even bother to investigate who was bailing you out. You just took the money. My money. And when you didn't pay me back, I legally foreclosed on your offshore company." Sylvia Rossi turned to the judge. "Exhibit C, Your Honor. The forfeiture documents, signed, notarized, and legally executed under international corporate law. Apex Ventures and the $22 million inside it is the sole property of Catherine Sterling, and per Richard's own post-nuptial agreement, it cannot be touched in this divorce." Pendleton was physically shaking. He looked at Richard, a mixture of rage and professional terror in his eyes. "Richard, tell me you didn't default on a loan against your own offshore accounts." Richard couldn't speak. He was drowning in a sea of his own meticulously crafted paperwork. He had spent years setting up traps, creating legal labyrinths designed to starve his wife out, to leave her begging for scraps. He looked at Catherine again. She wasn't just surviving his traps. For the last 5 years, while he was busy sleeping with his assistant and hiding money, Catherine had been quietly, methodically, learning the architecture of his empire. She had taken his post-nup, the ultimate weapon he designed to destroy her, and she had weaponized it against him. Every time he opened a shell company to hide money, she was the silent, invisible ink on the contract. Every time he sought a loophole, she owned the loophole. But Sylvia Rossi wasn't done. She returned to her portfolio and pulled out the thickest document yet. "Your Honor," Sylvia said, a dangerous edge creeping into her voice. "Now that we've established the real estate and the offshore liquidity, let's talk about the crown jewel. Let's talk about Sterling Global Logistics itself." Richard's head snapped up. "No, that's impossible. I built that company. My name is on the door." Mr. Pendleton stated his client is the sole owner, Sylvia said. But I have the corporate restructuring documents from 2023 right here. Sylvia Rossi did not rush. She allowed the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom to stretch, letting Richard stew in the toxic realization of his own hubris. The overhead fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, casting harsh shadows over Arthur Pendleton's suddenly greying complexion. Richard's custom Brioni suit felt less like armor now, and more like a straitjacket. "The 2023 restructuring," Sylvia repeated, her voice echoing lightly off the oak-panelled walls. "Your Honor, Mr. Sterling is laboring under the tragic misconception that he still holds the reins of Sterling Global Logistics. Let us examine how that illusion was maintained, and how it was legally dismantled." She handed a dense, perfectly bound stack of documents to the bailiff, who carried them to Judge Carmichael. She then handed a copy to Pendleton, who looked at it as if it were a live grenade. 2 years ago, Sylvia explained, turning to address the courtroom, Sterling Global Logistics faced a severe liquidity crisis. Supply chain disruptions had decimated their quarterly earnings, and Mr. Sterling was desperate to inject capital into the firm without alerting the board of directors to his gross mismanagement. He hired auditors from Deloitte to find a quiet solution. The solution they proposed, and which Mr. Sterling eagerly adopted, was to issue a massive new block of preferred voting class shares. Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He remembered this. It was a brilliant maneuver. He had sold the shares to a silent private syndicate, raising $40 million overnight. It saved the company, and because the shares were held by a faceless proxy board, he maintained operational control. Or so he thought. He sold 51% of the total voting power of his own company to an entity known as the Garrison Trust, Sylvia continued. A blind trust managed by a third-party fiduciary. Mr. Sterling assumed that because he appointed the initial fiduciary, a golf buddy of his, he would forever control the strings, but he didn't read the fine print of the Garrison Trust's charter. Judge Carmichael adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages. "I'm looking at the charter now, Ms. Rossi. Section 4, paragraph 2. "Exactly, Your Honor." Sylvia smiled, a razor-thin curve of her lips. "The charter explicitly states that the fiduciary has the absolute right to liquidate the trust's holdings if a more profitable, secure investment presents itself, without the consent of the original seller. And 14 months ago, that fiduciary received an offer he legally could not refuse." Richard's breathing became shallow. He looked at Catherine. She was no longer doodling. She was sitting perfectly straight, her hands clasped elegantly in her lap, watching his world burn with the passive interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining theatrical play. "The Garrison Trust sold every single preferred voting share of Sterling Global Logistics," Sylvia announced, her voice rising to command the room. "They were purchased at a premium by a private wealth management firm called Vanguard Strategic Holdings. Vanguard, Your Honor, is entirely funded by a private account held at Morgan Stanley, an account belonging exclusively and entirely to Catherine Sterling." Pendleton dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood, rolling off the table and hitting the floor. He didn't bother to pick it up. He just stared blankly at the opposing counsel. "You bought my company," Richard whispered, the words scraping out of his dry throat. He ignored the judge, ignored his lawyer, locking eyes with the woman he had spent 5 years treating like an irritating roommate. "You bought my life's work with what? Your grandfather's money?" "No, Richard," Catherine spoke up, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of pity. "I bought it with yours." Judge Carmichael slammed his gavel down. Order. Mrs. Sterling, direct your comments to the bench or through your attorney." "Apologies, Your Honor," Catherine said smoothly, dipping her head in a gesture of profound, manufactured respect. Sylvia stepped in front of Catherine, shielding her client like a gladiator, delivering the final blow. To clarify for the court, and for Mr. Sterling, Catherine didn't use inherited wealth for this specific transaction. She used the dividends generated by Apex Ventures, the offshore account she legally foreclosed upon when Mr. Sterling defaulted on his secret loan. She used his own hidden millions to buy the controlling shares of his own logistics empire. Richard felt the room tilt. The walls were spinning. It was a closed loop of absolute destruction. Every single trapdoor he had built to hide his wealth had been hijacked. He had funneled money into offshore accounts to hide it from her. She took the accounts and then used that very money to buy his company out from under him. "According to the post-nuptial agreement," Sylvia said, tapping the original document lying on the podium, "any business asset acquired by an individual during the marriage, using individual funds, remains their sole and separate property. Catherine used her sole and separate property, the Apex funds, to purchase Vanguard Strategic Holdings, which in turn purchased Sterling Global. Therefore, Sterling Global Logistics is not a marital asset subject to division. It belongs entirely to the defendant." "Your Honor, this is fraud!" Richard finally exploded, leaping to his feet. His chair crashed backward onto the floor. "This is a coordinated, malicious corporate coup disguised as a divorce. She manipulated the markets. She extorted my fiduciaries. Mr. Sterling, sit down this instant," Judge Carmichael bellowed, his face flushing with anger. "One more outburst and I will have you remanded to the county jail for contempt. Do you understand me?" Richard stood there, his chest heaving, his expensive suit suddenly feeling tight and suffocating. He looked at Pendleton for help, but his high-priced bulldog was completely defeated, his head buried in his hands. Slowly, mechanically, Richard picked up his chair and sat back down. "Counselor," Judge Carmichael said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble as he addressed Pendleton. "Do you have any documented evidence to refute the corporate filings presented by Miss Rossi? Do you have any proof that these transactions violated the post-nuptial agreement your own client drafted?" Pendleton didn't stand. He just shook his head. "No, Your Honor. The filings appear legally sound. The corporate veil has been pierced, but the underlying ownership structures are intact." He was giving up. Richard's own lawyer was conceding the empire. The remaining hour of the hearing was not a legal battle. It was an autopsy. Sylvia Rossi methodically dissected the corpse of Richard Sterling's financial life. She moved on to the primary residence in Buckhead, a sprawling 12,000-square-foot mansion with a temperature-controlled wine cellar and a 6-car garage. Richard believed he was safe there. He had transferred the deed to a charitable foundation, the Sterling Family Philanthropic Trust, claiming it as a tax-exempt historical preservation site while continuing to live in it. "As the court can see," Sylvia explained, projecting a copy of the foundation's bylaws onto the courtroom screen, "when Mr. Sterling established this charitable foundation to evade property taxes, he required a board of directors. To keep it in the family, he named himself, his wife, Catherine, and his brother, William." Richard scoffed. William was his flesh and blood. William would never betray him. "However," Sylvia noted, clicking to the next slide, 3 years ago, Mr. Sterling and his brother had a severe falling out over a failed real estate venture in Dubai. William resigned from the board in disgust. Mr. Sterling, in his usual arrogant haste, never bothered to appoint a replacement. He assumed his vote as chairman was enough. "It is enough," Richard hissed. "It is not," Sylvia corrected gently. "Under Georgia state law regarding non-profit governance, a board must have a minimum of 3 active members to achieve a quorum for major structural changes. But for daily operational decisions, a simple majority of active members suffices. With only 2 active members left, Richard and Catherine, it was a stalemate. That is, until last month." Sylvia handed the final piece of paper to the clerk. "Last month, the Foundation held an emergency meeting. Mr. Sterling was notified via his corporate email, but as usual, his assistant filed it away as spam because it didn't pertain to golf or his logistics company. Catherine attended the meeting. She proposed a motion to remove Richard Sterling as chairman for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. Since she was the only voting member present, the motion carried unanimously." A collective gasp echoed from the small gallery at the back of the courtroom. Even Judge Carmichael looked momentarily stunned by the sheer, clinical precision of the ambush. As the sole remaining active director of the Sterling Family Philanthropic Trust, Sylvia concluded, her voice ringing with finality, Catherine legally voted to evict the current tenant, Richard Sterling, effective immediately, in order to convert the property into a battered women's shelter. A notice of eviction was served to Mr. Sterling's legal residence this morning at 9 a.m. Richard was completely paralyzed. His mind simply could not process the volume of catastrophic information. He wasn't just losing his money, he was losing his company, his homes, his secret stash, and the very roof over his head. And the most agonizing, soul-crushing part of it all was that it was entirely legal. It was completely bound by the rules he had written. Judge Carmichael took off his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. He had presided over family court for 2 decades. He had seen billionaires fight over silverware, and he had seen spouses burn millions in legal fees just to spite each other. But he had never, in his entire career, seen a financial execution executed with such flawless, terrifying grace. The judge looked down at Richard, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "you came into this court today seeking to enforce a post-nuptial agreement that you clearly designed to leave your wife destitute. You utilized complex, aggressive corporate maneuvering to hide assets, evade taxes, and shield yourself from the equitable division of marital property. You demanded that the letter of the contract be upheld." Carmichael picked up his gavel. "The court grants your request. The post-nuptial agreement is hereby upheld in its absolute entirety. Per the evidence provided, all assets currently held in the name of Catherine Sterling, her LLCs, her trusts, and her holding companies are declared her sole and separate property. This includes Sterling Global Logistics, the Aspen Estate, the Apex Venture Funds, and control of the Philanthropic Trust." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "as you currently possess no significant liquid assets, no equity, and no residence, the court denies your motion to offer a $4 million alimony buyout. You don't have $4 million, Mr. Sterling. In fact, reviewing these documents, you are effectively bankrupt." Judge Carmichael banged the gavel. The sound cracked like a gunshot. "Judgment for the defendant. Court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted into quiet, frantic whispers as the gallery processed the slaughter. Pendleton immediately shoved his papers into his briefcase, refusing to look at his client, and practically sprinted toward the double doors. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he wasn't about to drown with the captain. Richard remained frozen in his chair. He slowly turned his head to look across the aisle. Catherine was standing up, smoothing the front of her navy Dior suit. She picked up her slim leather portfolio. She didn't gloat. She didn't laugh. She simply walked around the table and approached him. Richard looked up at her, his eyes red, his arrogance entirely hollowed out, leaving nothing but a pathetic, terrified shell of a man. "Why?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "You could have just taken half. You didn't have to destroy me." Catherine looked down at him. The smile was gone now, replaced by a cold, impenetrable calm. "5 years ago, Richard, you sat at our dining room table and told me that I was a liability," she said, her voice so quiet only he could hear it. "You told me that if I didn't sign that post-nup, you would tie me up in court until I couldn't afford to feed our children. You thought I was weak because I stayed quiet." She leaned in slightly, the scent of her expensive perfume cutting through the stale air of the courtroom. "I wasn't quiet because I was weak," she whispered. "I was quiet because I was reading." Catherine turned on her heel and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open, letting in a flood of bright, blinding hallway light, and then swung shut behind her, leaving Richard Sterling sitting alone in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of the empire he had built and the paperwork that had buried him. If this story of ultimate courtroom revenge and brilliant legal strategy kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, share this incredible story with anyone who loves a flawless plot twist, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life drama. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.